for a minute of silence and reflection. Thank you. So just off the top, I want to say that we have 2 zoning cases on the agenda, one for Strickland Road and one for Tarboro Road. Both of those need to go through the CAC process to get votes. Their next meetings are October 8th. And in order for us to consider the votes from the CAC, we would have to hear that on our meeting on the 22nd of October. So my intention, unless there is a number of people here to speak on Tarboro Road, is to defer those until the 22nd of October. Is there anybody here to speak on Tarboro Road? Can you come back on the 22nd of October without? Okay, so then we plan to defer both of those cases to the 22nd of October. So you don't need to stay for those if that's what you're here for. Okay. All right. So then, as part of the procedure, at the beginning of every regular Planning Commission meeting, we allow a comment period where anybody can speak up to 3 minutes on any topic that does not appear on the agenda. We have a maximum of 10 minutes for the total time period. So I think we have 2 people here to speak on something, and so I welcome our first speaker. You have 3 minutes.
Hi. My name's Helen Tart. I live at 611 Monroe Drive, and I'm here to discuss a project that came before the CAC, Z1719. I'm actually for the project, but I'm here for 2 reasons. The first is a request that I hope you will make of the applicant when they come before you. This project and the Kane project that is already approved will change the entrance to downtown for better or worse. Without extensive cooperation between the 2 developers, the change will very likely be for the worse. The design that has been proposed for this project is fine by itself, but we don't know what John Kane has in mind because he came before us as well and said so. What I would like for you to do is to recommend that the applicant work with John Kane to make sure that the towers complement and not clash with each other. Because I realize most businesses, they often compete rather than cooperate. And so it seems to me that some persuasion might be needed to get the 2 developers to work together. And if John Kane realizes that the Zimmermans are simply responding to something that you guys asked them to do, then perhaps he will be more willing to cooperate. Actually, my hope is that they would cooperate with a artistic walkway about 30 stories up between the 2 buildings to so the high-risers living in the towers could interact and maybe everybody could enjoy a view of traffic down below and the city beyond the buildings. It might even be a good use of city funds to contribute to making it artistic. My imagination has been ignited by the idea of these 2 projects, the grocery store and the bus rapid transit nearby, the possibility of a gateway entrance to the city, the idea of a 40-story neighborhood instead of a 400-acre neighborhood makes me want the development to see not just financially, but as a community. Cooperation is needed for that to happen. The other reason that I'm here is that I wanted to explain why the, sorry.
Start, that's your 3 minutes.
I'll come back.
Okay, thank you. Hi.
Good morning. I'm Linda Watson, a Raleigh resident and a member of the Pachamama Alliance RTP. We're part of an international group that's devoted to creating a sustainable world for all of us. I'm here to invite you to a workshop that we're doing on Project Drawdown on Saturday, this Saturday from 2 to 4 p.m., and urge you to take strong action on climate change. Project Drawdown is the ongoing work of an international team of more than 200 researchers and other experts. They identified and modeled the 80 most substantive, already existing solutions to address global warming. Led by author and environmentalist Paul Hawken, the group found something extraordinary. It's possible to not just slow down global warming, but to actually begin reversing it by 2050. That's what drawdown is, when carbon in the atmosphere stops rising and begins to fall so that the planet can cool. Raleigh and other cities play key roles in either producing less carbon or pulling it out of the atmosphere. 22 of the drawdown solutions involve materials, buildings, and cities. Researchers were surprised to find that the solution with the most impact is improved refrigerant management, very hot. Others include alternative cement, building automation, green roofs, smart glass, bike infrastructure, and walkable cities. I urge you to guide Raleigh in adopting drawdown solutions rapidly. We are concerned that Raleigh's community-wide climate action plan calls for a carbon reduction of only 80% by 2050. This is better than no target, but last year's report by the UN's International Panel on Climate Change called for net zero, a 100% reduction by 2050 to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Every fraction of a degree leads to extreme weather, hunger, disease, and forced migration. The U.S. Fourth National Climate Assessment called out Raleigh as one of 3 cities in the Southeast most vulnerable to the urban heat island effect and future heat risk. We ask you to plan for resilience through our building codes, green purchasing, energy conservation measures, and by increasing our tree canopy. I hope to see you at the workshop on Saturday, and if you can't make it, I hope that you'll read about Drawdown. I have copies of the thing, and just please remember our house is on fire, and we need to act urgently.
Thank you, Ms. Watson.
I have a quick question. What
Yes.
did you say that your name of your organization was?
It's the Pachamama Alliance.
Chua word.
Yeah, and
Oh.
Pachamama is an earth goddess from the Amazon.
How nice, thank you.
Very good, thank you.
And Linda, where is the workshop?
Thank you. It's at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum in the Education Center this Saturday from 2 to 4. We'll have another one in Pittsburgh at the end of October, and I've spoken with the sustainability staff here about having one for city employees. I don't know how interested they are in that, but I've spoken with them about it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Please pass around the materials. Catherine.
And if you would hand everybody a copy of the poster. The poster's suitable for posting.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Watson and Ms. Tart, for speaking to us this morning. So I'm going to move us into the agenda today, and for some reason not listed on the viewers, that it doesn't say that we have a committee report from the Transportation Committee, but we do have one that Mr. Geary would like to share with us.
Well, I just want to note that the slides and the PDF that were presented to the Transportation Committee were on the board docs agenda, and they're worth reading. Jason Harden also sent an email to the committee, I guess, a week ago, and I forwarded it. There he is. Forwarded it to everyone on the commission this morning. It's got information about transit-oriented development and equity in Charlotte, in Denver, in Indianapolis, and our staff's white paper on that topic. And I think they're really important to read and really important for Raleigh to go going forward. So I just want to make note of their presence on our agenda today. We also need to find a new committee meeting time. We were meeting at 8 a.m. Once a month prior to this meeting, but we can't get into the building that early anymore. So if I could get together, huddle with the members of the committee after this and see if we can come up with a different time, that would be good. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Gary. So the only item in old business we have is a case that we've deferred to October 22nd, Z2319. We won't hear that today. So moving on to new business. Was there something? Okay, all right. Moving on to new business, let's go to CP 1019.
Good morning. Excuse me. This is a request primarily to amend the urban form map in the comprehensive plan. So this was following the adoption of the Falls North Corridor Plan in May. At the same meeting, directly following that action by council, Councilmember Cox requested this amendment to sort of extend one of the recommendations from that plan. So I have presented to the North CAC, not been back for a vote, with no strong interest for me to go back for a vote, and so your deadline is in December. The Falls North plan is probably hard to see this contrast on your screens, but is basically the Falls of Neuse Road corridor from Durant up to the Neuse River, and then some land use area recommendations in cyan there. So the intent of the plan, as stated in the very beginning, is to preserve the more park-like character, the rural and vegetated nature, specifically towards the bottom of this paragraph. Mentions specifically tree preservation and main corridors as being a driver for the planning effort. So with the adoption of the plan, we now bring forward a suite of comp plan amendments. One of those was to the urban form map. So this has been adopted by council. It was to apply the Parkway corridor designation on Falls of Neuse from Durant Road to Waterloo Park Lane, and then also a little bit on Raven Ridge, which is this stretch between Falls of Neuse and Moose Creek Drive. So the request before you is not this, but this lighter green, so to extend the Parkway corridor designation on Falls of Neuse all the way up to Capitol Boulevard, and then on Raven Ridge all the way south to Durant Road. There is also a corresponding policy, text policy in the Falls North plan that says where the Parkway corridor should be and mentions Moose Creek Drive as the terminus of that. So also would amend that to have where the new Parkway corridor would end, which is Durant. Consistent policies having to do particularly with Falls of Neuse. So there is, besides the FN1 there, which is in the area plan itself, there is a policy about Falls of Neuse Road in the urban design section, and then other things about scenic corridor and trees and things. And that's all I have. Again, until December, happy to answer questions.
Any questions for Mr. Mabel?
I'm just trying to understand how this fit into the previous planning efforts. So that was, if I remember correctly, like a year long or more public planning process.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so I'm just trying to understand like why this is just being added now.
It was, or more, I think, so longer than a year. I'm not sure I can answer directly why the limits of the Parkway corridor that were in the plan came to be that way. So why this original green line did not go all the way. I can tell you, both in my interaction with the CAC about this topic and other times, and then the phone calls I've gotten from the mailing, people who are aware of this plan are supportive of this particular extension. I think part of it is the plan itself. The boundaries did not go all the way up to Capitol, so that's partly why the portion on the north, I think the plan borders probably on Raven Ridge didn't go all the way to Durant also. So the selection of the plan boundaries are even further back in time. I'm not quite sure.
Try the.
Sorry, it's not touchscreen.
Yeah, that one.
So I think your answer is these stretches of these two roads were not in the boundaries of the Falls North plan, but the community would have preferred as much Parkway corridor as they could get, I think.
Okay, even though it wasn't part of the public process. So this hasn't been through the public this is the first
This-
part of the public
This is
process.
right. So the comp plan amendment is the extent of the public process so far. So I have been to the CAC, and as is our practice, have done a mailing for everyone affected within 100 feet of the corridor. I've received quite a number of phone calls. Most people really concerned mostly with the road and whether roads would be widened. And after hearing the explanation that it's a land use policy, have either lost interest or been supportive.
It's going through the UDO required public
Yeah.
process, but I guess maybe what you're saying is it might have been a more comprehensive process with prior amendments, but it's going through the notice and coming to planning commission is the public process.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Gary, did you have a question?
That section of Raven Ridge, is it wooded now?
I believe that particular part, so there is some parkway frontage already in the area. I can't recall precisely where it is or not.
So conditions vary along the corridor. There are existing tree buffers in some locations and not in others. The impact of the parkway designation in the comp plan is very simple. It means that if a rezoning comes in for a property along Falls and News Road, in order to be consistent with the plan, they have to ask for the parkway frontage. And if there are trees in the parkway frontage today, they have to preserve them. And if there's not, they have to plant a 50-foot buffer street yard. So that's essentially the impact of this change, as well as just being a policy statement on the map that this is the type of corridor we want.
So there's nothing sitting in that parkway frontage zone now, other than trees, I mean.
Oh, and are there buildings in the 50 feet?
Yeah, there's
Can't-
nothing that would be pushed off the,
Well, again, the standard is, I can't remember there being any buildings within 50 feet of Falls and News Road. But if there are, and there's no regulatory impact on the current zoning until someone decides to file for a zoning change. So if there's a building within that buffer and the property is zoned, say it's in a residential district, there's no extra requirements put on that property. It would only be if they were going to change their zoning district to a mixed-use district, they would have to ask for a parkway frontage. And of course, if they were going to do that, there would be a high likelihood that the property would be redeveloped, at which point it might be possible to meet the 50-foot buffer. But there's no impact on properties that are not asking for a rezoning.
and no one objected to this.
Not that I'm aware of now.
So I guess I just asked the question because that stretch to Capitol has primarily, at least from what I can see, commercial parcels.
Yes, especially up closer towards Capitol.
So I just, I'm just thinking about how this significantly could impact even a tenant improvement to some of these commercial developments.
Again, this is not by itself regulatory. Only that tenant improvement involves asking for a change in zoning district. With this policy, and it's still policy.
Okay.
You could conceivably approve the case inconsistent with the frontage recommendation. But in order for a staff determination or a recommendation that the case is consistent, it would need to have the parkway frontage attached. If they already have mixed-use zoning without the parkway frontage, they can continue to utilize that zoning, and this has no impact on them.
Okay.
This is just giving you guidance for future rezoning cases.
Any other questions for staff at this time? Okay. Oh. Was there something? Okay, I thought I saw you about to ask a question or give some guidance. So I just want to remind everybody of the process. So the applicant and proponents for this case will have 10 minutes, a total of 10 minutes to speak. After the applicant speaks, then proponents will have 2 minutes each to take up the 10 minutes. And then opponents will have 10 minutes to speak. Each speaker has 2 minutes. And we ask that speakers don't duplicate comments. And after the comments are in, the applicant will have 2 additional minutes to respond to any issues or questions raised. So at this point, if there's anybody here from the applicant, that would be the city, wouldn't it?
Right.
Sorry. All right, so if there's anybody here that are proponents, please come forward. Any opponents, please come forward.
Yes, good morning. I'm Ronald Rogers. I'm with the Williams Mullen Law Firm, 301 Fayetteville Street. And we're here this morning on behalf of our client, Triarc Food Systems, which owns the parcel located at the corner of Raven Ridge Road and Durant Road. There's currently a Bojangles restaurant located at that site. This is the southernmost part of that Raven Ridge extension that you see on the map. Obviously, we have no concerns or objections to the Falls of the Noose Road designation, but we do have concerns about the application of this 50-foot buffer to the southern section of Raven Ridge Road. To provide some background, our property was part of the Falls River Master Plan that was rezoned back in actually 1994. As part of that master plan, the southernmost 100 feet approximately of Raven Ridge was abandoned and relocated. So that whole section on which our property is located is actually something that was planned and designed and landscaped in accordance with that plan. And what we're concerned about is, since we're in a zoning district that's sort of a legacy district, it's a planned development zone, that it's not like the normal analysis. So what we're asking is that you take this to one of your committees and study it further. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for the applicant before we consider the request?
Yeah, how far up Raven Ridge does that planned
The applicant.
development go?
Right. The approved, when it was approved in 1994, it extends actually about 1,500 feet from the intersection. So it's well landscaped right now. There's a sidewalk, there are trees, there are natural areas. It looks fine. It was designed deliberately that way. This wasn't an instance where you had pell-mell development along a section of the road. And again, since we're in a planned district zoning, it looks to us from the UDO that, again, was adopted much later, that if we want to do anything other than a very minor change, we have to go through a rezoning, well, actually an amendment to the plan. So that might trigger the rezoning and all the concerns we have about trying to, retroactively install a 50-foot buffer, which frankly isn't really needed along that area.
Could you say your name again for me, please?
Ronald Rogers.
Ronald Rogers. Any more questions for Mr. Rogers? Okay. Is there anybody else who came to speak in opposition to this? All right, seeing none, let's bring it back to the table.
Sorry, did you ask if there was anybody in favor besides the city?
Yes,
Okay.
I did. It was, everybody just, yeah, all right. Yeah, crickets. All right, so let's bring it back to the table. Any discussion at the table?
There is, that was kind of my question going in, if I was understanding our earlier comments.
Yes.
As far as any changes through that corridor, because I've been up there and seen I was thinking there was a shopping center on the north side of Raven Ridge, but maybe not, on the corner of Raven Ridge and
Yeah, there
Falls.
is.
Isn't there? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why I was thinking
Yes.
there's a shopping center there. And on the the other, I couldn't remember what was on the other side, but I just, to his point, what the impact on those existing businesses would be. You know,
Can you pull up the zoning?
inherently, I have no problems with the plan. It seems to be fit in the character, but I wouldn't want something, to
Right.
his point, to negatively impact their future.
So there is shopping center, there are retail uses up and down there. They're kind of almost developed in a parking limited style, frontage style with a row of parking and a street yard, but less than a 50-foot street yard between that parking and the Raven Ridge corridor. I think we're pulling an aerial up here so you can see that part of it. Now this is zone PD plan development, which adds a little extra wrinkle. So there's a master plan associated with this, and although you can specify frontages in a PD, this particular one predates that tool. Now the PD zoning is on the ground. Changes to the shopping center that are consistent with the planned development district that it's under are fine. If they went to come in to revise the planned development master plan, then yes, we would want, in order for consistency with this designation, you would want to see something in the master plan, either the specification of a frontage along Raven Ridge or equivalent language within the master plan that called for a 50-foot buffer and street yard along Raven Ridge Road, which would be different than the existing condition. But in terms of re-tenanting the existing buildings or building within the footprint of the buildings or building within the parameters of the current master plan, that would be allowed because no rezoning would be involved, and therefore there would be no regulatory impact for this change. And not being familiar with the contents of this particular master plan, I couldn't really speak to what would and would not be consistent with the language that's currently mapped.
So can you point out where that Bojangles is on Durant Road? Is it the one on the east side of Raven Ridge, the building?
I'm not entirely sure. Based on the aerial, I would guess this one. But
That's the one on the left, that's on the west side of,
sure.
Yes, it's on the left side.
yeah.
It would be right in here.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay,
That's, and to the point about a master plan amendment in section 4.7.6 of the UDO, there are very few things that can be done administratively. And subsection B says anything that's other than a non-administrative amendment has to go through the rezoning process. So the question is, does that then trigger the need, if you're doing something other than this very short list of minor things, if you have to go through and amend the master plan, does that then require you, as a condition to that, having to put in the 50-foot buffer area retroactively?
Well, there's policy guidance that would say for the zoning change to be consistent with the designation on the map, there would have to be a 50-foot buffer along Raven Ridge Road. Whether or not there needs to be an amendment to the master plan is something that I can't answer because I don't know the contents of the master plan in detail, and I don't know what's being contemplated for this particular site. But the site was apparently developed under the master plan. The current built condition is consistent with the master plan. I would guess that things that are similar to it are consistent with the master plan. So but you know, if there were a proposal to dramatically alter the built condition out here that was not consistent with the master plan and that required a rezoning, then yes, the 50-foot buffer would be something that would be needed for consistency with this map change.
Zoom out on that picture just a little bit so we can see where that PD ends.
Basically, what they're trying to, like previously it looks like it ended at the PD, and this is saying that it will extend through the PD, which seeing that is troublesome to me. See, it actually ends right there.
Mm-hmm.
That adds a lot of question marks.
I could come down a little bit.
Wait a second.
Zoom out, sorry.
It's the PD, right?
Yeah.
A little bit farther, but I mean, to the point, I mean.
What's the point?
Yeah. I mean, well, clearly the intent, they want consistency through the whole corridor, but I don't know if extending it into the PD is necessarily a good idea.
Nothing there is park-like at the moment at all.
Yeah, exactly.
So, that's why it's confusing to me.
Yeah, for the future of that.
Mr. Mabel, do you know if we've had any calls from people in that particular part of the area that got mailers?
I believe just
Okay.
the gentleman who just spoke.
So we don't know if we had any calls in support for that particular part of the area?
No, again, people were just looking for more information.
Okay. But you said generally people were in support when they got in touch with you. I didn't know if they were
Or not in objection.
not in
Let's say that,
objection.
yes.
Zoom in just a little bit.
When did this start? Well, how was it initiated and who initiated it? I think I missed that.
So it was in May of this year, on the 21st of May, the Falls North Plan was adopted. And then after council action, Councilmember Cox, who represents this district, requested this additional comprehensive plan amendment.
And then it just goes through the system?
Right.
Huh.
Is R1 over on the left-hand side?
Mm-hmm.
Does that
So this is the
follow Raven Ridge, or?
This is the E.M. Johnson Water Treatment Plant,
Okay.
which I believe also accounts for this pool on the south side.
There you go.
So no residential uses in the R1 district.
Okay. So that current little hook going there, nothing's gonna change there, so
I mean, I think this is also I think staff evaluation would say this is not fronting on Raven Ridge Road unless
okay.
something were to happen there. But again, that's city property owned by public utilities.
So the commercial uses down there from Durant up to, they go up to about that property. Is there a cross street up there just above Shadow Lawn? Is there another cross street just right in there, right there?
Getting up to
Or is it all, I can't,
Savannah Oaks Way, I suppose, would be.
yeah, that's further up than I thought. I was looking at all this, what looks like wooded area down below in the PD.
Right.
Yeah, down to right there where there's kind of empty lots on either side.
Something getting ready to be built.
Yeah, so if the change, the parkway frontage came that far, since there is already commercial there, could we suggest a change to have it stop there? I mean, I can't reference a cross street because there doesn't seem to be one. I think those are power lines I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah, and I'm happy to come back in 2 weeks and present a little bit more information. There is the other issue that Mr. Tomasula brought up earlier of sort of a similar situation. You're going to reach up towards Capitol. Most of this is already pretty wooded, but I think these are all mostly commercial properties. So I can come back with a fuller information about existing zoning and uses on the corridor.
And whether there are 50-foot buffers already, I mean, those look like they could be already 50-foot buffers there, so they wouldn't necessarily be struggling with that particular recommendation.
Probably not, no.
When we look back at where Raven Ridge is coming down, I think there appears to be something getting ready to be redeveloped.
There is a active zoning case on this property here.
We were looking further down at where those
further down
power
here.
lines were,
Yeah.
those two
Right,
empty.
The brown square.
Right. So I would have to look into that
Kind of
further.
looks like something might be going on there, but I think I'm willing to gamble that the intent is to preserve the existing trees within the PD, kind of where it stops just north of that site.
Yep.
And I don't know whether that can be done or not, but, clearly, once you hit that site, it is commercial. There are no trees there now, and I would hate to create a difficulty for the shopping center tenants or owners and tenants in there. Just my thoughts.
So we could just defer this, or we could move this to committee of the whole. I mean, I'm puzzling over what's there, and I think we all should go out and take a look at it. I appreciate the objection to it. I don't really understand the proponents' thinking on it, so it'd be worth finding that out as well. I mean, not you,
Sure.
the original proponent. So that's a thought. I don't know, do we want to put it in committee or do we want to just hold it here?
And that's the question. So do we have a full committee of the whole meeting this week, and it would not appear before us.
It would be the following.
It would be the late October
Mhm.
meeting. So I'd prefer to see some more information in 2 weeks personally. And we can still refer it to committee of the whole if we need to at that point. But it sounds like there are a lot of questions, and we'd like to know a little bit more about the uses, especially closer to the commercial areas and what exists up at the top near Capitol about, is there already tree buffer there? So does that kind of give you some guidance
Yes, I
for
think
what
so,
we
yeah. I'd
might
be
want
happy
to
to
hear
do
about
that.
next time?
Mhm.
There's no rush though, right? I mean,
No.
why can't we just put in the committee of the whole to have a better conversation about it?
Because we can't do that until October, and we could hear more in 2 weeks. And we can still put it in the committee of the whole in October. So I'd
Correct.
rather hear more sooner than
Mhm.
pile it into the committee of the whole where we're already kind of socked in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody have any objections to that?
I think that's fine.
All right. Okay, we'll have this one back in 2 weeks. Thank you. All right, moving on, we're going to TC 1119.
Not sure the proponent has a lot of time to deal with this. He's the proponent.
All right, I'll get started. So this is a text change that's before you related to shopping centers. The primary goal of this text change is to address shopping centers as a use and specifically as it relates to parking. So to provide a little bit of background, parking within the UDO is specified, parking requirements are specified by use, and typically are expressed as a ratio of parking to floor area. So the example provided here is that for an office building, one space would be required for every 400 square feet of floor area. And so there's different assessments that are made based upon use and the demand that they'll have based on amount of customers, et cetera, and that relates to a ratio and the amount of parking they must provide. So as it relates to shopping centers, as they're commonly understood, the parking requirements, when there's a tenant change out especially, can be problematic. The issue is each tenant is treated individually as an individual use, even though the shopping center typically works kind of as a consortium of different uses and oftentimes has kind of a variable need, and then there's various uses within a specific center. So the way our plan review process works is there's a trigger related to parking. So if a parking requirement for any tenant change out increases the demand by 10 spaces or 10%, whichever is less, so in certain cases, one space could be over 10%, then the applicant must go through the site plan process. And this is important because the site plan process requires dedication of public improvements. And in a shopping center context, this could be considerable improvements to the entire shopping center itself just for a single tenant change out. So because it's assessed kind of on a site basis, and shopping centers typically are looked at as a single site review. So the proposed change would rely on language taken from the old code and create a use classification and use standards for shopping centers specifically. So it would modify the use table to include this classification of shopping centers. You can see the districts there that it would be permitted in. And most importantly, it would address this parking concern and set a parking ratio that falls between that of retail and office, because that's generally seems to be the expected kind of mix, would be some types of office uses, some types of retail, and other commercial uses. So here's the proposed definition. Again, this is pulled from the old code, more or less, and it's that defined as a planned unified development that contains at least 3 establishments with commercial recreational uses and contains at least 25,000 square feet of gross floor area on a land area of at least 2.5 acres in size. There are 2 use standards associated with the definition or with the use classification. Those are that the shopping center contains at least 3 establishments with a minimum of 1 commercial or recreational use. The shopping center may contain more than 1 lot and other uses permitted by the applicable zoning district. The shopping center contains at least 25,000 square feet of gross floor area on a land area of at least 2.5 acres in size. So that really wraps up my presentation on the text change. In terms of the actual text, it's fairly minimal, but I'm happy to answer questions you may have.
Any questions?
Trying to think of how to express it. We would see this more in the redevelopment of an existing shopping center, the impacts of it, more so than necessarily a new shopping center, right?
Yeah, I think the immediate benefit would definitely be to existing shopping centers because that's where we see this issue arise with tenant changeouts.
And what is starting to happen is, shopping centers a long time ago were all retail. There might have been 1 or 2 food establishments in a shopping center. And now the whole model of shopping centers, malls and everything has moved to much more food-related type stuff. So you have huge staff needs of a restaurant versus a retail establishment. So I do have concerns on parking is an issue one way or the other. I don't know how this impacts it, but I do see that as being a trend that isn't going to change anytime soon. How would this impact current trends in shopping centers? Any thoughts on that?
So the type of change out you're talking about, where a former retail space becomes a dining space, is one of the things that typically triggers this type of site plan requirement. And that's because restaurants on a per square foot basis have a higher parking ratio associated with them for the reasons you stated, as well as the fact that the density of patrons within a restaurant is typically higher than it is in a retail establishment. There's parking, the regulatory construct, and then the parking, the physical reality. So from a regulatory construct standpoint, what this would do would allow dining establishments to go into a existing shopping center, and there'd be no change in required parking. Parking demand would likely change in reality, and depending on what the parking supply was in the shopping center in question, it would either be adequate or it would fill up or not. So that's one of the things. The part of what this is trying to solve is the fact that changes in required parking are part of the triggers to go from a plot plan to a site plan with all its attendant requirements to meet right-of-way dedication and bring the whole site up to code for parking lot landscaping or other things of that nature. So part of the impact we're dealing with is not something that is dealt with by adding more parking to the site. It's like invoking a bunch of other requirements that are kind of unique to our code because we have this plot plan, site plan distinction, and one of the triggers from going from plot plan to site plan is an increase in required parking of 10 spaces or 10%, which basically every change out to a restaurant from retail to restaurant will meet that threshold. So this is one way of addressing that. The other way of addressing it is currently pending, which is to rethink some of the plot plan, site plan triggers that are currently in the code. But this is reinstating something. We used to have a shopping center category in our code pre-UDO that had a unified ratio for these types of, for the shopping center use, and it seemed to work pretty well. But I just want to draw a distinction between what the regulations are requiring in terms of required parking, how it relates to the site plan, plot plan distinction, and what the possible impact might be of changing the ratio for shopping centers.
If I'm understanding all that right, then what we're really, this really doesn't, it has to do with parking a little bit, but it's really more just not triggering a massive change within what's going on, or potentially a very large change just because you change that antenna.
That's right.
Okay.
And part of the notion is that any building type has to be able to evolve with market conditions.
Exactly.
Tenants change, the demand
Right.
changes, and how onerous do you want that process to be?
Right.
Now, this is not solving another issue, which is the change out of a tenant in a small building in like downtown or on Hillsborough Street, where they're also having to get a bunch of variances because they're going into a non-conforming historic building, putting a restaurant in, and having to say, well, we're not going to dedicate right away for our 50 feet of Hillsborough Street, and we're not going to provide parking because our building covers the entire site, and we're not going to do all these other things. That's going to be dealt with through a different look at the plot plan, site plan distinction.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think you just answered a question I had, which is, what about shopping centers that are less than 2.5 acres?
This would not apply, and so they would potentially be swept up in the same process they're swept up in now.
Yeah, concern, and I don't know whether this exists anywhere, but a small shopping center without much business and without much parking now has busy restaurants in it, and the parking is inadequate, so it spills over into the surrounding neighborhood. That's why we have these parking standards, right?
Well, yeah, so an example of that, although the restaurant is now has been closed for a while, is the old shopping, the little strip mall at North Person Street and Franklin Street, which I'm familiar with because I live 2 blocks from there. And of course, as part of a larger revival of that corridor, now our parking regulations exempt all of those uses because they were in a PBOD and now they're in an urban frontage. And so they've been exempt from any required parking for years. If they hadn't been, none of those restaurants would have been able to open. They would have all been illegal, or they would have had to get variances. The interesting thing about the site plan, plot plan distinction is when the language of the code says you have to calculate required parking as if you were not getting the exemption of being in an urban frontage, as if you were out on, a suburban strip without any special parking relief. And so it's always been confusing to explain to applicants who are bringing a restaurant to a space that, oh, we're not requiring you to have any parking. However, you have to come through the site plan process because required parking is increasing, and we're calculating that as if it was required, even though it's actually not required. So don't worry about it. You don't have to provide any spaces, but you do have to come through the site plan process.
Right, so, but that's in an urban context, right?
Yeah,
So I'm not concerned about that. I understand that.
but in a suburban context, it could be different, and if there is no parking relief, then there's clearly the intent of the code is that you provide for your needs on site. In a suburban context, that's what the intent of the code is.
Ken?
So I guess a related question I have is the 350 spaces. That seems like there's a good reason why you picked it, but what is the ordinary parking requirement for a restaurant as opposed to a retail use?
I believe it's 1 to 150, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
150?
So yeah, 1 space per 150 square feet. Yeah, and it,
All right. Thank you.
Ken, I had one other question.
Yes.
Isn't it true as well, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, that even if, say, a shopping center has more spaces, the calculations are still relative to what they're required and what the new count is?
That's right. They could have a vast parking field full of empty spots and ample capacity to absorb the use change, but they would still be swept up in the site plan trigger because, again, it doesn't look at physical parking, it looks at the regulatory parking.
Right.
Any more questions for staff at this time? Okay.
Is there any concern or plans to look at sites that are less than 2.5 acres? are there many that would?
Again,
fall into
there
that
is
category?
a, okay, so this is pending in council committees to look at the site plan, plot plan distinction. And part of what you may have heard of, some regulatory hurdles that some recent high-profile restaurateurs have run into, Jolie up on North Person Street, poolside buys, because they were all considered site plans, and therefore, given the fact that they were reoccupying long vacant historic structures, ran into a ton of variance issues because they were site plans instead of plot plans. And there are other issues with it as well. Not unique to that, even the reuse of small suburban outbuildings could fall into this. So there is a process to look at this plot plan, site plan distinction. An idea that's going to be presented but has not been vetted with the council and nor authorized to move forward is maybe instead of looking at parking in these places where it's not required, if we've exempted you from parking requirements in the code, we'll also not make that a trigger for site plan, plot plan. But again, that's at this point a speculative idea, but it's one idea that might solve a lot of the issues that we've been seeing in the older parts of the city where old buildings are finding new tenants, but having to run into a much more lengthy regulatory process with trips to the Board of Adjustment than they would otherwise like.
Thank you.
Okay, so the city is the applicant.
Yes.
Okay. Are there any people here who are here to speak in support of this text change? Anyone here to speak in opposition? All right, let's bring it back to the table. Any more thoughts among our members?
I agree with Matt that we have vast seas of parking in Raleigh that we don't need.
I mean, this allows for, I think, honestly, more interesting, more creative, adaptive reuse of a lot of these shopping malls, strip malls, et cetera, that have kind of gone by the wayside to some degree, and allows for a little bit more creativity and reprogramming of them. I mean, I think we're seeing it at Gateway. They've I think one or two tenants stayed through, but I know that I saw them, they had to go through, they didn't do anything to the building, to my knowledge, but they're having to redo the entire parking lot, frontage, everything. And so it also could see residual effects on existing tenants, where really some of the work that's required can really have a negative impact on longer term tenants that want to stay in, that the landlord probably wants to keep, while still trying to maintain a relevant experience. So I don't know, it seems to make sense. I guess the only other thing I'm just curious about is how some of the folks who have done the most recent few developments of retrofitting shopping centers might feel with this, but it seems like it's at least cutting the requirements and increasing that delta by 50% at minimum, so that it's at least seems like it's starting to give them more bandwidth.
So I subscribe to the idea that we shouldn't be triggering site plan every time a tenant use changes. My concern, I guess, is with the number, with the 350. The old standard was 250. And now we're looking at shopping centers that have more restaurant use, so maybe the small shopping center that didn't really have quite enough parking before, I can't name one. They seem to have lots of parking, but perhaps there will be some that as they move to restaurant use will have not insufficient amount of parking. So
This is 2.5 acres, so that's pretty big.
And just to answer a question about how the number was derived. So it was the same methodology that was used in the former code. The ratio for retail in the former code was 1 per 200, office was 1 per 300, and the shopping center parking requirement was right down the middle at 1 per 250. So this takes the same approach. The ratios have just shifted. So retail is 1 per 3, office 1 per 4. This splits it down the middle.
I think like for new developments, probably be market-driven, you know, even if for some reason they're not required to have as much parking, but they feel like they need it for their customers, I'm sure they'll provide it. But I'd like to think it also encourages other modes of transportation, hopefully. Maybe not so much in suburban areas, but it seems like it's a little, could potentially make things more dense and less parking, which I would support.
Any additional thoughts? I'll entertain a motion.
Well, I'm going to move to approve. Bow to staff's wisdom on this 350. Why not?
There's
Second.
Thank you.
Second.
Yes, so you're referring to staff's comp plan policies?
Their comp plan recommendation. Yes.
Reasonable for the
That was
reasons
it.
in this, okay.
There is,
You
so,
read so well aloud.
so do you have the, yeah,
Ah.
please,
Stick with the
yes.
comp plan.
Okay, as to text change 1119, I move approval because after considering the policies and other materials included as part of the 2030 comprehensive plan, we determine that the proposed zoning change is consistent with the 2030 comprehensive plan and should be approved.
Second.
And other adopted.
I think we had a second from Tika.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm
okay,
sorry.
sorry.
That's okay. Any further conversation? All right, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, say no. Okay, moving on to TC 1219, unsafe building code.
Oh, on that, just on that, I didn't bring it up, but the bicycle standard in that is very slight. So the parking standard for bicycles, staff, they're not listening to me. As you consider changes, change the car parking standard, but the bicycle parking standard is 4.
Yes.
That would be something to maybe think about.
Okay, thank you. That's a good suggestion.
Right, this is an amendment to Article 11.5 of the UDO to incorporate expanded statutory authority for areas the City Council declares to be community development target areas based on statutory criteria. This text change would give statutory authority allowing an inspector to declare a vacant or abandoned non-residential building or structure unsafe if it is within a community development target area. Under expanded authority, a vacant or abandoned non-residential structure that is in a dilapidated condition such that it would constitute a public nuisance can be declared unsafe, and the owner would be directed to remedy that condition. If the owner fails to do so, the city can bring court action or follow statutory requirements to have the building demolished. This text change will define community development target areas and allow its designation, and it will also provide how notice is served and provide appeal language and the measures for enforcement of any possible penalties. This is a text change that was authorized by the City Council and drafted by the City Attorney's Office. I'll just make a note of that, and I'm available for any questions.
Any questions from Mr. Holland or other staff?
I have a question. Was there an instance that triggered this?
I'm not aware of any specific instance, but the City Attorney's Office may.
No, and we have Deputy City Attorney here, Dottie Keebler, who can answer any legal questions. She was involved with staff with drafting it if there's any. I don't know if she knows the answer to that question or not, but we can. And Nicolette Fulton is here as well.
Thanks.
From our office with code.
Good morning. Yes, I believe that there are places in the city in which conditions exist. This code change will allow us to have an additional tool in the toolkit. And so if a non-residential structure falls within this definition and is within the target area that meets statutory definitions, then this gives us a different approach. It's a more, lenient is not a good term because it's still a very rigorous standard, but the standard to declare property unsafe relates to blight and blighted conditions in a way that typical unsafe requirements do not. So for us, it's giving us additional methods to enforce in an area that's facing blight or that has poverty, certain low poverty level.
Community development target areas, are they currently identified all over the city, or is this the type thing that once we see a blighted building that, well, maybe that should be in a community development target area? What's kind of the order of things on that?
No, and this is statutory. So the state statute allows the elected body to establish the community development target area. And the code language tracks the statute, or the proposed code language tracks the statute, which sets out certain statutory criteria. In essence, what the council will be asked to do under this code change is be provided by staff with information establishing that these statutory criteria are met. And so the statutes come in part out of the redevelopment laws, and they do set standards that relate either to blight in the area or poverty in the area, or could be a combination of both.
I have a question about, I'm sorry, my question is about, what about buildings that have historic relevance? Would they be protected with this?
So this would not change the historic overlay districts. This would not change any zoning requirements, and that would be an issue pursued through another avenue.
Okay, forgive me, I don't think I'm clear. I'm not talking about specific districts. I'm talking about maybe buildings, because a building can have historic designation and not necessarily be in a district.
So if it is a landmark building, if it is a building that is going to be protected by historic regulations, then those regulations would apply as opposed to these unsafe regulations. No, the council would have to, the council would have to declare the specific area in which this new language would apply.
Just for clarity, the city does have some existing redevelopment areas that were declared in the past using the blight findings of the urban redevelopment law, but those are not automatically qualified as community development target areas under this. So at this point, there are no such areas designated, and affirmative action of the council will be required to designate them.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
So if I have a blighted building and it's not in an area that would be designated a community development targeted area, what is the city's power to either condemn that building or fix it?
So I'll let Nick talk to you about that. Nicolette Fulton with the City Attorney's Office handles much of the code enforcement. The short answer is we'll have to follow current standards under the law, and this new change would not apply.
So right now, our 11.5 under the UDO is not as robust as to what we are allowed under North Carolina General Statutes 160A 426. If we are allowed this text change, the powers under 160A 426 subsection B and C would allow us to expand that authority, particularly when it comes to buildings that are in a very poor state, buildings that, as we have talked about, that are in dilapidated condition, buildings that are attracting criminal activity, and we have those buildings within the city. And Mr. Geary, going to your question, you know, we as a city, when it comes to enforcement, want to make sure that the city and our charge is pursuing what we're allowed to do under the UDO. But if our hands are tied because of the language that we're given within the power of the UDO, we're not able to do that.
And so if I can chime in, a building that is not within the community development target area and is not subject to this code change, if it's a non-commercial, if it's a commercial building, non-residential, our existing unsafe ordinances would apply. That would set a higher standard. Blight isn't a consideration when declaring a property unsafe. Hazard to the public safety, such as the likelihood of walls falling or the building spontaneously combusting. So those are the issues. A higher standard under the unsafe than is allowed with the code change.
And just to speak to one more issue when it comes to this community development target area, that would only apply to buildings that are vacant or abandoned and that are subject to this blight, dilapidated, attracting and vacant or abandoned and non-residential buildings or structures. It would not apply to residential buildings. So that is also within the state code, that there would have to be a separate ordinance change for it to apply to residential buildings.
I do have a question with regard to residential, the definition of residential. Was it the most recent use? Was it the original use? Is it zoning? I can think of a lot of, I can think of a house.
The building type, yeah.
A building type that I have seen, I mean, it's falling into disrepair, but it was originally a house. It's zoned currently commercial and last use was commercial, but it's a house.
So from the unsafe statutes and from the code language that is proposed, the higher standard is going to apply to both residential and non-residential. And so this new standard, the blight-based or poverty-based standard, the community development target area, will be non-residential buildings or structure. And from the city's perspective, we might look at what the use was or is currently. If it is vacant and abandoned, what its use was immediately prior. So that's going to depend on how the facts come forward to the inspector.
But all buildings within the city will be subject to the expanded definition consistent with state statute of making sure that they're not subject to the bad conditions of walls, overloaded floors, defective construction, decay, unsafe wiring, what your typical definition, the statutory definition of what is an unsafe building. That would apply to all buildings.
I guess my knee-jerk reaction is I thought we weren't in the planning world like using this sort of language anymore. Well, it's just like, I don't know, it just, maybe I'm not understanding it, maybe I'm overlooking something. And I don't want to, I know that there's state statutes and all this stuff, and I don't want to like cause a huge issue out of this, but it just, I don't know, something's not sitting right.
I have a kind of similar question. I understand life safety and health issues like that. Those are pretty definable and understandable, and you can assess them. But how do you determine if a building is tended to attract persons with intent on criminal activities? How's that determined? So
that, again, is going to be fact-based, and it's going to be the responsibility of the inspector to have the information to support what's basically an administrative determination. So the council's role is to establish the area. It's the inspector's role to have the facts sufficient to justify use of this code provision. And if I can back up, some of the language, if I were drafting this without the state statutes to cabin my discretion, I would not use the language that exists, but we are stuck with state law. And the cases that interpret these unsafe provisions are very clear that we can go no further than the statutes allow us. And so to ensure that we are consistent and in compliance with state law, we've used the language of the statutes. That's really important in the enforcement context, because if we have an active enforcement where we're in the right, but we get to court and are challenged because we didn't track the statutory language, we might have a bad result. And so we are using that language that the General Assembly has obligated us to use instead of what we were doing if we were creating this from the get-go.
Just so I can kind of visualize, how large of an area typically is a community development target area?
It usually goes by census tract or census block group.
So at a census tract level?
Or even as small as a census block group, so not a very large area at all.
Sort of block, I mean, the entire block. Thank you.
And there may, that's not the only, but that may be one area when we're thinking about blight.
It's more than a lot. I mean, you know,
Correct.
It could be a census, as large as a census tract, as small as a census tract.
Correct.
Block, okay, just gives me an idea.
And that is how the area would be defined for application of this.
Yeah.
So that area is defined, and if the property were located within that area, it could be applied to that.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I don't have the ordinance in front of me. What are the city's options when it declares a property in a community development target area? When it declares it blighted, do we have any options other than to tear it down? Can we fix it up?
Yes, we could make an order to repair, to vacate, to close, to demolish. And the facts that the inspector has will determine what decision the inspector makes.
So you're talking about ordering the owner to do something.
Yep.
I'm talking
Yes, sir.
about what options does the city have?
So the code says that the owner is the entity that needs to make the first step. And then if the owner fails to carry out those statutory duties, then the code allows typical enforcement, which is civil penalties, a court proceeding in which an order is issued by a judge, an injunction requiring action, or then if this was a demolition, the city could demolish, could make a determination to demolish.
Well, but what I'm asking is, could the city make a determination to fix, or is its only option at that end stage to take it down?
So there is always an ability to negotiate with an owner, but the remedies track the statute. And so what the statute allows, the code now allows.
When you say fix, you mean the city actually sending people onto the site to do work on the building?
The city takes control of the property, and rather than tear it down, fixes it up. But now the city is the owner.
Well, I think we would have to obtain ownership of the property to do that.
Yes,
obviously.
but if you're condemning it, you own it, don't you?
If we condemn a property and take possession of it, then obviously it's within the city's power, if any other owner of property, to decide what to do with the structure on it, whether to rehabilitate it or replace it, or to sell the property to another party to do one of those things.
That's correct.
I mean, is it
I'm
broadly
sorry.
characterization, absent this authority, that the city's ability to take action against a vacant, dilapidated property that's creating an unsafe condition is much stronger if that property was used for residential purposes than if it's commercial. And this is somewhat bringing, for these areas, commercial property into parity in terms of what our enforcement options are, or is that a mischaracterization?
I think it is giving an additional protection to the city for areas of blight that need special treatment and special consideration for vacant buildings that are causing, or abandoned buildings that are causing significant problems.
So if there were a hotel somewhere in Raleigh, out on a major highway, and it's vacant, you might declare it blighted under this.
Use your microphone, please.
Under this designation and actually take control of it?
So for us, we're looking at this as at a policy level, and not at targeting any particular establishment for action. But we are looking at how this might affect.
Hypothetically.
We are looking at how this might affect citywide. One of the other things that we did in putting this together, Ms. Fulton and I met with the folks in community development, and we met with the folks in planning to make certain that we understood what impact this might have citywide. So, but we're looking at this as changing the code citywide.
Yeah, I guess I'm just looking for a little bit more clarification on what was it that triggered, it doesn't sound like anything triggered this, but how did it even get on the radar to be in consideration?
Well, I'm not sure that that's something that I can speak to at this point. I can say that this provision in state law is in other jurisdictions and it's not in our code. And so in thinking about just generally problems that the city has had and thinking about the issue at a policy level about what options are out there, especially dealing with vacant or abandoned structures, what can we do that we do not presently have the ability to do? This was an option. And I think, as Ms. Fulton pointed out, there are vacant structures in Raleigh, and each one of them, the non-residential structures, bring special problems to the community.
What's the definition of vacant? How long do you have to be empty before you're vacant?
There isn't a definition of vacant in the statute, and so that's going to be something that an inspector will need to bring forward. And in general, you know, we look at what other sections of the code might say to that issue.
Because my greater question would be abandoned versus vacant.
Right, and there's some case law on abandonment, what constitutes abandoned, higher, harder standard to meet, as opposed to just empty for 365 days. So that would be something that Ms. Fulton and I would work with the inspector to make certain that our evidence, when we brought forward an abandoned building, was consistent with state law.
And more so to your point, it's more so a point of clarification about potential criminal activity. It's, when you were talking about the investigation, it's more so when you're going in and you see maybe paraphernalia that should not be there. Is it more something like that as opposed to, this is what I presume could happen in this establishment? Or items that are actually visible?
Correct. It would be based on actual factual information, not based on assumptions. Can I go a little further? It would be based on police reports, actual reports of criminal activity taking place, or as you stated, paraphernalia being observed.
So my only thing on that point is, you know, we're having this discussion here and now about that and saying hypothetically, or it would be based on police reports and that sort of thing. But, you know, let's say 5 years from now and they don't have that same discussion. I mean, is it detailed in that it says it's police report, it has to be this, it has to be that?
It's not.
So it could be anything. 5 years from now, somebody could have a different interpretation and say it could be anything. To the extent like maybe a loitering case and that's it.
The statute, as it states specifically person's intent on criminal activity, and it is that standard is one that can be argued before the courts. And just to be frank with you, it is one that can be argued before the courts. But to take that forward, we would have to have some evidence of criminal activity.
One other question on this community development target area. If an area, if that designation is made to a census tract or to a census block, what effect does that have on the properties that aren't being contemplated as being a problem within that target area? Is there any effect at all?
So one of the issues that I think that we have talked about internally, and one of the administrative processes is whether the community development target area will have a limited time associated with it. And so that is something that we're considering administratively when a designation comes before council. The designation only allows the additional trigger so that we can deal with vacant or abandoned buildings in a community development target area. Not all buildings.
But there is
Just
no other effect of other structures within that zone.
There is nothing under the unsafe provisions that applies to a building in a community development target area. So once council designates an area, only a vacant or abandoned building is going to be subject to the slightly less rigorous standard.
So it would not make any unintended changes or allow anything else to go on to structures within the community development target area that aren't vacant.
The target area is only related to the unsafe building. It's not related to any other planning or land use activity. It's just the council designates this one area that needs special attention in general, that there are bad problems coming from vacant or abandoned buildings that can't be handled in another way. You really heard Ms. Fulton talk about the work that has to go in from an inspector before you get to the place where you have a building that can use this code provision. This is not designed to be easy, and it's designed to be done in a thoughtful way with substantial evidence. But without this code change, when there are failures to handle problems in particular areas, and you've got a long-standing issue, this code change will allow us to address the long-standing issues.
I guess my concern is that given the size of these areas, which I know in some respects you may not think it's large, but to me it's a fairly large area, a whole census tract potentially, or even a census tract block, that I'm completely on the other side of the block in my little house over there, that all of a sudden this neighborhood, this block gets tagged as a community development target area. What type of negative connotation could follow my property forward that if I go to sell it, so, oh, you're in a community development target area, what's wrong over there?
Well, and that is an issue that we have talked about, and that's going to be something that the council has to consider when it makes a designation. And then from an administrative perspective, the recommendation will be to have some time limit in which that expires, so the community development target area for this unsafe purpose terminates. And so those are the ways in which we have talked about handling the issue.
Is it possible that it could terminate at the resolution? For instance, if it was demolished, would that not be the end of the situation?
I cannot predict how things will happen in a particular area, or whether you end up in a 5-year court battle. And so we would want to take those things into consideration and have the flexibility to deal with them.
And my other question is about when you're saying the building, I'm thinking about maybe if the issue is within a strip mall. So what do you do with a building with maybe entities that are connected? So it's one long building, but maybe there's one problematic or one place that meets that standard, but not the entire building.
We would look at that issue, but I will just tell you, I would not be optimistic that it falls within the vacant or abandoned. If it's a single structure and only one bit of it is boarded up, I think that would be a difficult case. I'm not saying one way or the other, because I'd want to look at that and know what the facts are, but I think that would be a very difficult case.
But a community development target area could be just a
Probably not. I can't say that for certain because there's not a case directly on point, but probably not just one building. The characteristics in a redevelopment area or an area that is an urban progress zone is going to require more than that. The code and the statutes allow the council to consider areas with similar characteristics, but it would be very difficult to say, unless it's one really big tract, that a single small parcel was an area. And typically, what in my 20-some years I have seen serving as enforcement is in that role is that it's a larger area that's at risk with a small building that's vacant building causing problems.
Is there any language in the text change that speaks to if that the subject structure needs to have a long-standing issue? How is that determined?
No, ma'am. It is really inherent in the idea that the inspector has to have evidence that the building is in such dilapidated condition as to cause or contribute to blight, disease, vagrancy, fire, or safety hazard, or be a danger to children, or to attract people intent on criminal activity. And so that's the first step in the process to even get to have the vacant lower standard apply.
And is this the first time we're introducing this definition of community development target area? It seems like it was maybe defined in previous code.
No, it comes straight out of the state statutes.
All right, I have one more comment. I think that this tool is useful and helpful in solving structures that are, magnets for continuing to promote problems in, particular neighborhoods or whatever. Some of the language just I'm not that comfortable with. I understand that you're probably taking from the state language, and I'm not a lawyer, and I pretend to be, or even understand the law half the time.
Didn't stand
But
Holiday Inn.
is there an opportunity here to introduce language that achieves the same important goal, but feels a little more contemporary and equitable?
So I am going to go all lawyer on you and to say that every time we deviate from the statute, we inject uncertainty into our code. And so from the lawyer's perspective, to have a defensible code, which is really important in a situation in which you may be ordering someone to do something they really don't want to do, to either repair a building that has been vacant and abandoned for a long time, or to demolish it. You want to be sure that your code survives judicial challenge and review. And so, though I know what the General Assembly has chosen is clunky, I think it very important for the city to follow that language.
I would just say, I think something Dottie said earlier was important about case law as well, and that, this is the terminology that's used when cases look at city action underneath these provisions and underneath this statute. So it kind of, in keeping with consistency, like Dottie said, once you go outside of the statutory language, you're also kind of going into uncharted territory, I guess you would say as well. So.
Okay, we have not yet heard from the public on this, and so we may have people here to speak in opposition or in support. So if there's anybody here that would like to come forward and speak in support of this text change, please come forward. If there's anybody here that would like to speak in opposition, please come forward. Okay, let's bring it back to the table. Is there any further discussion about how to proceed with this text change?
I'd like to think that we have fully contemplated all the ramifications of this. I will be the first to admit, I know it means good and all that other, but I have real reservations when you start talking about large areas that it would have to be a fairly heavy lift in my mind to designate an area for this. I'm just, from my perspective, I do have real concerns about the impact that it could have on surrounding property owners. I mean, that's what I'm looking at now. And I would have to guess that this is really targeted for a really bad situation that you're gonna have to, you can't deal with this under other unsafe building guidelines that we have within the city, that this has really risen to a fairly high level. So I'm gonna look at it that way and take it for that. But I hope that as this moves forward, that we can really define the length of time that this goes on, that and really give serious contemplation to what impacts it will have to other property owners within the community development target areas. That's, I understand sometimes we run into situations that are very difficult to deal with and to clean up, but I also don't want this to create a burden on other people that just happen to live or own businesses in the area.
And I understand that, but as I'm sitting back thinking about it, I would think about the burden that it causes to have a blighted building within distance. So I understand the concern about maybe not the label, but the consideration and for the period of time. But I'm also weighing that with the consideration of having structures within your community and what the impact it has on business, on residential areas, on safety, in the total part. So with, like you, I'm thinking that it's more extreme as opposed to, on the other side of the spectrum, that is really to a severe state, and what that says for the community in and of itself.
As I understood it, I think that we already have some tools to tackle blight and dilapidated buildings. So this just kind of adds another layer. So we still technically, I think, can clean up.
But I think, I get that, but I think there may be some cases where it's harder to do so, because as they said that there are, where'd they go?
Our attorneys, yes, please come forward in case there's a.
That if that were possible, then why has it not been done? Because they said there were various pockets or certain designations to be considered that they already have in their purview. Or did I misunderstand?
I can speak to that. Right now, our unsafe ordinance is not consistent with the statutory unsafe ordinance, and it's not as complete as it can be. It does not cover as many aspects of the unsafe language as the statute does, as the North Carolina General Statute does. And it does not cover blight. It does not cover dilapidated buildings. It does not cover non-residential buildings and structures. It does not cover the robustness of the state statute. What this text change does is, number one, it makes us consistent with the state statute. And number two, it brings us into the robustness of the state statute to provide us all of those extra tools that we do not currently have. Right now, our current unsafe ordinance is one paragraph.
And if I understood you earlier, you said the building's got to be basically falling down and a physical hazard to go into. Is that what you said?
Right now, what an unsafe ordinance would require is it to have, I believe Dottie has the current version.
So short answer, yes.
Yes.
It's very bad conditions, hazards based on fire, or I think about falling pieces, not just internal, but out into the rights of way that are going to trigger the insane.
Life safety issues would trigger our current life safety ordinance. Right. Whereas this has specific issues dealing with unsafe wiring, overloaded walls, and it goes into the robust character that if the inspector can identify them, can bring it into the unsafe ordinance.
Is there case law or from other cities around the state that have enforced this?
Yes, I've actually spoken with other municipalities throughout the state, and the city of Fayetteville has actually used this exact provision.
So we need to determine a path forward here. I do want to say, for my part, I believe that the city should have this tool. And I am also squeamish about the language, but the language is the state statute, and I understand the legal need to stay in lockstep with that in order to be protective of the city in court. But we need to decide how we're going to deal with this case. Are we going to hold it at the table for 2 weeks for people to think about? Are we going to move it into text change for more conversation? Or are we ready to make a motion on it today to either recommend approval or denial? Do we have any sort of guidance from the members about where you're thinking we should go?
I'm comfortable moving it on. I mean, I know that since it's moving within statute with lockstep, if you will, with existing statute, you know, I think that it makes sense. But I gotta. That's my question is probably you're a little bit higher level than that, even as far as the heavy-handedness, but that's okay.
And is it possible to get clarification on those timeframes that we were asking in terms of quantifying vacancy, quantifying, to get answers that way? Do you have time for that?
That would probably either, or hold it at the table. But would that make us diverge from state law if we were asking for timeframes?
That's something I would want to ask, if there's any type of guidance on what those definitions, if there's even a way, I guess, to define it. Is that
right? So I want to make sure that we're making the city able to defend itself. And so if we were to diverge by putting in timeframes or by discussing timeframes, does that cause us to put ourselves back into that jeopardy area that you were?
We would have to impose on ourselves more, a more strict standard than state law allows.
Okay. And so what you would really like to do is have what state law allows and which other cities are availing themselves of without any sort of deviation from that language.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Does that help? Okay.
Well, I don't want to be an impediment here, and honestly, I have not read the proposed ordinance. I failed to, I guess it arrived late and I didn't see it. So I think we could be more restrictive. Not having read the definition of community development target area, but hearing that it could be pretty expansive, I think we could be more restrictive without running afoul of the state law. I would at least like to think about that.
I would kind of take the opposite stance of that, because then you open up the door to make it more difficult to be able to bring it forward or to defend it. In my mind, and so I don't know. It could. Anyway, that's kind of my thought on it.
What's your pleasure, to hold it for 2 weeks, or I think is that where you're heading with this, or would you like to?
If I'm the only one who wants to hold it, I will bow to the majority, but I am not comfortable with it fully yet. And if others aren't, I would suggest we hold it.
And what are the thoughts of the other members? I'll just start at the end. Would you like to hold it, or would you like to move forward today?
I think it makes sense. I'm just trying to understand some of the definitions, and I think there was like a little bit more information about support of, what's the definition of, the community targeted area? How did this even come on our radar? Is it just to clean up administrative? I don't know. And what was the Fayetteville case, and how did that come out?
Okay. sounds like we want 2 weeks there.
Right.
All right.
I would agree to get those questions answered.
Okay. All right.
I would support that.
Okay.
I'm gonna be down here all by myself on the right side of the table or left side of the table, depending on where you're sitting. My take on this is we're trying to bring it into compliance, if you will, with state statute, that if a case were brought forward, everybody's gonna lean on the state statute as being the standard to be able to meet on both sides of whatever the argument is. And so to deviate from that puts our city at a disadvantage in order, just from a legal standpoint would be kind of my interpretation of it. There's a lot of questions that I have on it, same as everybody at the table, but I'm just kind of looking at what the intent of the text change is.
And if I may just further expound my thing, I agree with you that we're trying to strengthen the city to do what they need and having the backing of the state statute. I just think for me, I would like to know the clarity of, I'm not in opposition. It's just, okay, so when this makes this statement, I'm in full clarity as to what that means and the implications of. So that's just for me. I'm in full support. I just want to have a better understanding.
Was Mr. Holland back there? Is that? Yes, there you are. Okay, I wasn't even sure. So it sounds like we have some questions and we want to hold it for 2 weeks. Do you think we can arrive at some answers to those questions, or do you think did you understand the ask?
Yeah, we can get the
okay.
Answers to those within 2 weeks.
I would be prepared to move it forward. It sounds like David would be prepared to move it forward today, but yeah, I think there's enough concern about just getting a better feel for it and having an opportunity to read it that we should hold it for 2 weeks. And so I'm good with that if there's no objection. I mean, is there anything? Okay. All right, so we'll hold it for 2 weeks.
Is there a time sensitivity to this in some manner?
I am not aware of a deadline. I know that we try to move as quickly as possible,
but there's not something pending.
Yeah, moving this within 2 weeks, you're still within your time frame for making the determination.
I didn't know if there was some specific case or something that could be floating around. Double check.
And if I would suggest if members have questions that come to mind during the 2 weeks, please go ahead and reach out to Mr. Holland and let him know what those questions are so we can try to move this forward next time. All right, thank you. All right, that brings us to the approval of the minutes for September 10th. Anybody want to make a motion about that or have any concerns about them?
Motion to approve.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. All right. Any opposed? Okay. All right, moving on to report from the chair. I have been waiting for the assignment from Wake County to finalize our plans for committees. So I may make just a few people swaps now that Ms. Lampton is here. But I really need that last person to know what fully the committees are, but I think we pretty much have membership arranged at this point.
I would urge you to think about moving ahead, just given their pace.
All right, so you think it may not be this year at the rate we're going?
I don't know.
Okay, all right. Well, that means we're going to continually be short here and having difficulty meeting quorum at times. So please, if you can, make the meetings. It's really important. Okay, so that's my report from the chair. Any report from members?
I just wanted to make an announcement that the Sir Walter Raleigh Awards is Wednesday, October 2nd. Excuse me. And I encourage you all to come out and support that. It's a fun event, and it's also nice just to support great design in our city. It starts at 5:30 with refreshments, and then at 6 the awards begin, and it's being held at the Raleigh Union Station.
All right, and now the report from the planning director.
Sure. So update from the September 17th City Council meeting, TC 419, which was the erosion sedimentation control ordinance, was approved. Avon Ferry corridor study and comp plan amendments was approved. They have retained the proposed street grid for Mission Valley while the issue with plot plan, site plan is worked out, that it may come back and actually end up in the comp plan at a later date. You remember that was the one sort of bone of contention while this was under review here at Planning Commission. TC 819 Mechanical Plumbing Examining Boards and Housing Appeals Board was scheduled for a public hearing on October 15th. That'll be in the afternoon. 3 items scheduled for the November 6th public hearing: Z619 Davie Street and Harrington Street, Z1819 Ponderosa Service Road, and Z1619 Fayetteville Street. Public hearings for 3 items have been continued to November 6th and will also be discussed in Growth and Natural Resources Committee. Those are Z2518 Lead Mine Road, TCZ 119 Spring Forest Road, and TCZ 219 Durley Road. And then the public hearing for Z1919 West Street was closed. That's the CAM site, and the case was deferred to October 1st. In addition, you may recall having worked on a text change for building height as related to whether we should have a height and feet cap. You reported a recommendation back to council. Council considered that recommendation, and now they have authorized a specific text change, so that what you voted on was just a recommendation for a text change, not the text change itself. But the text change itself, which will be a pretty simple one, is coming back, simply removing the height and feet for taller buildings in the table. Similar but not quite identical to the recommendation that you put forth. So expect to see that at a future meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Director. So we have pending items for the Committee of the Whole on Thursday evening at 4 p.m. We actually have a very full agenda, 4 cases. So be prepared to go as long as to 7 p.m. on the evening, and let's make sure that we have as many of us there as possible because we need quorum to hear them. So I don't want to miss that meeting because these are starting to stack up on us. And then looking back, I got to find my, where did it go?
I just wanted to make note that Michelle McIntosh has said a while back that I believe she won't be at that meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, so it will be important for us all to be there.
Thank you for reminding us about that. Text Change Committee will meet on the 15th of October. We have the omnibus text change in there, so we'll be able to talk about that next meeting. And Strategic Planning does not yet have another meeting planned, and Transportation Committee wants to talk about when you're going to meet. So do you want to do that offline after the meeting?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any further business to do today? All right. Meeting adjourned.